The Unseen Gardener and the Poisoned Prize Roses, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery blooms in a carefully tended garden, where prize-winning roses are the pride of the village. Each morning, the gardener was said to arrive before dawn, unseen and unheard, leaving behind beds of perfect color and scent. But when the roses suddenly wither overnight, their petals tainted with poison, admiration turns quickly to suspicion. The villagers argue over accidents and pests, yet Miss Marple notices what others miss: the timing of the watering, the footprints that do not match the gardener's boots, and the quiet rivalry hidden behind polite smiles. As she looks closer, it becomes clear that the poisoned roses were not the true target, but a message meant to wound far more deeply. Because in St. Mary Mead, even the most beautiful things can be used to conceal malice. Before we uncover who truly tended the garden that night, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Unseen Gardener and the Poisoned Prize Roses. The roses at the Bantridge Garden Show were meant to be the pride of St. Mary Mead. They stood in neat, disciplined rows beneath the pale morning sun, their petals rich with color, their stems straight and proud, their scent drifting gently across the village green. Red, white, yellow, and pink, each bloom had been trimmed and trained for months, watched over like a child learning to walk. Villagers gathered early that day, murmuring with polite excitement, admiring the careful labels, the polished brass cups laid out on a long wooden table near the bandstand. It was a day for quiet celebration, for small victories, for the kind of honor that mattered deeply in a village where reputations lasted longer than lifetimes. Miss Marple arrived as she always did, just after the bells had finished their final chime. She wore her usual hat, sensible and unremarkable, and gloves that had been mended so often they seemed more patch than fabric. She carried no notebook, no basket, nothing that would suggest she expected anything out of the ordinary. To the casual observer, she was simply another elderly lady come to admire flowers and exchange pleasantries. Yet her eyes, sharp and thoughtful, missed nothing. Not the way Mrs. Hargreaves hovered too closely over her winning rose bush. Not the tight smile on Colonel Whitby's face as he studied the judges. And not the faint, bitter smell that lingered beneath the sweetness of the blooms. The prize roses were judged at noon. 3 men from the neighboring village walked slowly along the rows, bending, sniffing, nodding, whispering to one another. The crowd followed at a respectful distance. When the final decision was announced, polite applause broke out. Mrs. Hargreaves had won first prize, as many had expected. Her roses were flawless, deep red, their petals thick and velvety, their leaves without a single blemish. She accepted the cup with trembling hands, her eyes bright with triumph. For a moment, it seemed the day would pass without incident, another pleasant memory filed away in the village's long history. Then Mrs. Hargreaves swayed. At first, some thought she had simply grown faint from excitement. A hand went to her chest. The cup slipped from her grasp and struck the table with a dull clang. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the grass, the red of her roses mirrored cruelly in the sudden flush of her face. A scream rose from the crowd. Someone shouted for a doctor. Someone else ran for water. Miss Marple did neither. She stood very still, her gaze fixed not on Mrs. Hargreaves, but on the roses themselves. The village doctor arrived quickly, breathless and flustered. He knelt beside Mrs. Hargreaves, checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, and then looked up with a face gone pale. She was alive, he said, but gravely ill. Poisoned, he added quietly, though he did not yet know how. The word spread through the crowd like a sudden chill. Poison was not something one expected at a garden show. It belonged to dark alleys and whispered scandals, not to neat lawns and prize cups. The roses were removed at once, handled with care, their soil wrapped and sealed. The cup was taken away. The band did not play. The crowd dispersed in uneasy silence. By evening, St. Mary Mead was buzzing with speculation. Some said Mrs. Hargreaves had used chemicals improperly and poisoned herself. Others whispered that someone had tampered with her plants out of jealousy. A few insisted it must have been an accident, that such things simply did not happen in decent villages. Miss Marple listened to all of it, nodding kindly, saying very little. That night, as she sat by her window with a cup of tea, she considered the details. The roses had been poisoned, not the tea Mrs. Hargreaves drank, not the cake she had eaten earlier. The poison had acted quickly, yet not instantly. It had been absorbed through touch or scent. A gardener's method, Miss Marple thought. Someone who knew plants, soil, timing. Someone who understood how to harm without leaving obvious marks. The next morning, the village was visited by Inspector Slack, who arrived with a look of weary annoyance, as though the crime itself had personally inconvenienced him. He questioned the judges, the organizers, the villagers who had arrived early. He asked about rivalries, about past disputes, about anyone who might wish Mrs. Hargreaves harm. Names were offered eagerly. Mrs. Denton, who had lost the prize 3 years in a row. Colonel Whitby, who believed the judges favored women. Mr. Bell, whose roses had wilted mysteriously the week before the show. Each accusation came wrapped in polite smiles and thinly veiled satisfaction. Miss Marple was questioned last. Inspector Slack did not expect much from her. He never did. She told him precisely what she had seen. Mrs. Hargreaves had not touched the roses immediately before collapsing. The gardener assigned to the show, young Thomas Reed, had been nowhere near the prize rose that morning. The soil around the winning bush had been disturbed earlier than the others, pressed down as though someone had knelt there for some time. Inspector Slack made a note, though his expression suggested he found the observation trivial. Thomas Reed was brought in for questioning that afternoon. He was pale, nervous, his hands rough with honest work. He swore he had followed instructions, that he had tended all the roses equally, that he had no reason to harm anyone. He admitted he admired Mrs. Hargreaves, that she had often praised his work. Miss Marple watched him carefully. His fear was genuine. His confusion real. He was not the sort who poisoned prize roses in broad daylight. As the day wore on, another detail emerged. Several villagers mentioned seeing someone in the gardens early that morning, before the show officially opened. No one could describe the person clearly. A figure bending among the roses. A hat pulled low. A coat too long for the season. Each account differed slightly, but all agreed on one thing. The person had moved with confidence, like someone who belonged there. Like a gardener. Yet no gardener had been scheduled to work at that hour. Miss Marple took a slow walk past the garden that evening. The roses were gone now, the soil bare and uneven. She bent slightly, studying the ground, the faint marks left behind. She thought of a woman she once knew, years ago, who had poisoned her rival's laundry soap, careful to wear gloves, careful to smile afterward. She thought of how jealousy often hid behind devotion, how resentment wore the mask of helpfulness. The unseen gardener, Miss Marple decided, was not unseen at all. The village had simply refused to look closely. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the mystery of the poisoned prize roses took root, deep and tangled. Someone had planned this. Someone had waited patiently, hand steady, heart cold. And Miss Marple, knitting needles resting quietly in her lap, was already certain that the truth, like the strongest weeds, would soon force its way to the surface. Chapter 2: The Hand That Tended Too Carefully. By the second morning after the garden show, St. Mary Mead had settled into a restless kind of calm. The shock had faded just enough for curiosity to take its place. Doors opened a little wider. Curtains twitched a little longer. Conversation stretched on at the post office and shortened abruptly when someone new walked in. Mrs. Hargreaves remained in hospital, alive but weak, drifting in and out of consciousness, unable to explain what had happened to her. The absence of her voice made the village louder than ever. Inspector Slack set up his temporary office in the small room behind the parish hall. From there, he summoned villagers one by one, asking the same questions repeatedly, hoping the truth would slip out through boredom or fear. Who had access to the roses? Who arrived early? Who had reason to hate Mrs. Hargreaves? The answers were polite, careful, and mostly useless. Everyone had opinions. No one had proof. Miss Marple observed it all with quiet interest. She attended the morning market, the afternoon tea at the vicarage, the evening prayer meeting. She listened far more than she spoke. People often mistook her silence for frailty, and in doing so, they forgot to guard their words. Mrs. Denton complained bitterly about the judges, insisting the show had been unfair long before the poisoning. Colonel Whitby muttered about declining standards and hinted darkly that women were far too competitive over trifles. Mr. Bell spoke at length about soil quality and pests, offering explanations that wandered nowhere near poison. And then there was Mrs. Lavender. Mrs. Lavender lived alone at the edge of the village, in a narrow cottage half hidden by overgrown hedges. She rarely attended social events, yet she was always aware of them. She knew who quarreled, who reconciled, who rose in favor, and who fell from it. She kept no garden of her own, yet she was often seen walking slowly past others, pausing to examine leaves, stems, and blooms with a critical eye. She spoke often of plants, of how they responded to care, to neglect, to harsh handling disguised as kindness. Miss Marple paid her a visit that afternoon, under the pleasant excuse of returning a borrowed book. Mrs. Lavender welcomed her politely, though with visible surprise. Her cottage smelled faintly of dried herbs. Bundles hung neatly from the ceiling beams, labeled in careful handwriting. Miss Marple admired them openly, asking harmless questions, remarking on their neatness. Mrs. Lavender responded eagerly, her voice warming as she explained which plant soothed, which strengthened, which harmed if used incorrectly. "It's all a matter of knowledge," Mrs. Lavender said, smoothing the edge of a cloth with precise movements. "Plants are honest. They do exactly what they are meant to do. It's people who misuse them." Miss Marple agreed, gently. She asked, quite casually, whether Mrs. Lavender had attended the garden show early that morning. "Oh no," Mrs. Lavender replied at once. "Crowds make me uncomfortable. I much prefer my walks when the village is still asleep." The answer came too quickly, Miss Marple thought. Too rehearsed. Later that day, Inspector Slack received the report from the laboratory. The poison used was derived from a plant extract, absorbed through the skin. It had been applied carefully to the stems and leaves, not the petals, ensuring the scent remained pleasant and the danger invisible. It required patience, precision, and familiarity. Not the work of a careless rival or a panicked amateur. Slack frowned at the paper, irritation deepening the lines on his forehead. "So we're looking for someone who knows plants," he said aloud, though no one in particular was listening. Miss Marple, sitting quietly nearby, cleared her throat. In villages, she said mildly, knowledge is often hidden behind usefulness. People trust those who help them. Inspector Slack glanced at her, unconvinced but attentive despite himself. That evening, another small disturbance rippled through St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Denton discovered that several of her rose bushes had been disturbed, though not poisoned. The soil had been turned, roots examined, then carefully replaced. Nothing was stolen. Nothing damaged. It was as though someone had simply checked them, methodically, before moving on. Inspector Slack dismissed it as a prank. Miss Marple did not. She recalled something Mrs. Lavender had said earlier, about plants being honest. About misuse. About knowledge. Miss Marple returned home and considered the pattern. The unseen gardener had moved confidently, without fear of being questioned. That meant the village expected to see them there. A helper. A volunteer. Someone who offered advice freely, who was thanked rather than suspected. Someone who tended too carefully, who knew exactly how much poison would sicken but not kill, who understood timing well enough to strike at the moment of greatest attention. The next day, Miss Marple attended the hospital, bringing flowers that were carefully chosen and harmless. Mrs. Hargreaves was awake, though weak. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I remember the roses," she whispered. "They smelled stronger than usual. I thought it meant they were perfect." Miss Marple held her hand gently. "Did anyone help you prepare them that morning?" Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated. Her brow furrowed. "Someone checked the soil," she said slowly. "Said it looked dry. Said she would fix it. I thought it was kind." "She?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Yes. Mrs. Lavender. She knows so much about plants. Everyone says so." The truth settled into place with a quiet finality. Not a dramatic revelation, but a familiar one. Miss Marple had seen it many times before. The resentment that grows when praise is given to another. The belief that skill should be rewarded, even if it must be taken. Mrs. Lavender had never won a prize, never been admired publicly, yet she believed herself superior. In her mind, the roses had been misplaced, the honor stolen by someone less deserving. That evening, Inspector Slack received Miss Marple's observations with thinly veiled skepticism. Still, he followed up. Mrs. Lavender's cottage was searched. Among her herbs, carefully labeled and stored, they found the missing extract. Measured. Prepared. Hidden behind a row of harmless remedies. When confronted, Mrs. Lavender did not scream or protest. She simply straightened her shoulders and said, "I only meant to teach her a lesson." It was, Miss Marple reflected later, the most dangerous sentence of all. As the village slowly exhaled, the roses at the garden show already felt like a distant memory. Yet beneath the calm, one final question lingered. Had the poisoner truly intended no lasting harm, or had fate simply intervened? That answer would come soon enough, as St. Mary Mead prepared for the final reckoning. Chapter 3: The Bloom That Hid the Truth. The village awoke the next morning with a strange sense of release, as though a tightly drawn knot had finally loosened. News travelled quickly in St. Mary Mead, and by breakfast most people knew that Mrs. Lavender had been taken in for questioning and would not be returning to her quiet cottage any time soon. Some spoke with disbelief, others with satisfaction, and a few with embarrassment, realizing too late how easily they had trusted her calm voice and helpful manner. The roses were no longer discussed as flowers, but as symbols of something darker that had been growing unnoticed among them. Miss Marple sat at her small table, knitting needles clicking softly, her thoughts steady and clear. For her, the matter was nearly finished, yet she knew experience had taught her that the final truths often revealed themselves only when people felt cornered by consequences. Motives, once exposed, had a way of sharpening. Inspector Slack arrived shortly before noon, his expression unusually serious. He accepted the tea Miss Marple offered without complaint and sat down heavily, as if the case had weighed on him more than he cared to admit. "She's admitted to poisoning the roses," he said. "Claims she measured the dose carefully. Says she never meant to kill." Miss Marple nodded. "Intent," she said gently, "is often kinder in memory than in reality." Slack frowned. "You think she meant more harm than she says?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that she convinced herself she was correcting an injustice. People who do that often stop asking where the correction might lead." That afternoon, the village received word that Mrs. Hargreaves had taken a turn for the better. The poison had weakened her heart, but she would recover, though slowly, and with lasting effects. Relief spread through St. Mary Mead, though it was tinged with unease. The line between harm and tragedy had been thin, and everyone sensed how close they had come to something irreversible. Mrs. Lavender was brought back briefly to her cottage under supervision to collect personal belongings. A small crowd gathered at a distance, pretending coincidence while watching intently. She walked stiffly, her head held high, her face pale but composed. She did not look at the onlookers. She did not need to. Their silence spoke loudly enough. Miss Marple observed from her window. She saw no madness in Mrs. Lavender, no wild desperation. What she saw was certainty. The kind that grows quietly over years, fed by small slights and overlooked efforts, until it becomes something unmovable. Later, during a formal interview, Mrs. Lavender explained herself in calm, measured tones. She spoke of her knowledge, her dedication, the countless times she had offered advice that went uncredited. She spoke of Mrs. Hargreaves as careless, lucky rather than skilled. She insisted that poisoning the roses had been an act of restraint, not cruelty. A warning, she called it. Inspector Slack listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked a single question. "And if she had died?" Mrs. Lavender hesitated for the first time. Only for a moment. "That," she said, "would have been unfortunate." Miss Marple heard of this exchange later and felt no surprise. She had once known a woman who loosened the bolts on her husband's ladder, believing a fall would frighten him into obedience. He had died instead. The intention, the woman insisted, had never been death. It never was, at least not openly. As the case closed, St. Mary Mead tried to return to normal. The Garden Show Committee announced that next year's event would include stricter rules, more oversight, fewer volunteers. The bandstand was repaired. The grass grew back where the crowd had gathered. New rose bushes were planted, though some villagers eyed them with lingering suspicion. Mrs. Hargreaves came home weeks later, thinner and quieter than before. She no longer spoke eagerly of competitions or prizes. When Miss Marple visited, she found her sitting by the window, watching the light move across the garden. "I don't think I'll enter again," Mrs. Hargreaves said softly. "It doesn't feel worth it now." Miss Marple took her hand. "Joy," she said, "should never be surrendered to bitterness. That would be letting the poison work twice." Mrs. Hargreaves smiled faintly, understanding more than she said. In time, Mrs. Lavender was sentenced. The village discussed the matter for weeks, then months, then less and less. New gossip replaced old. New grievances sprouted where the old ones had been pulled up. Yet something had shifted. The villagers looked more closely now at those who offered help too eagerly, who lingered too long where they were not required. Miss Marple returned to her routines, though she noticed how often neighbors now sought her opinion, her quiet approval. She accepted their trust with humility, aware of how easily trust could be misused. One evening, as she tended her own modest rose bush, she reflected on the case. It had never truly been about flowers or prizes. It had been about recognition, about the silent hunger to be seen and valued. When that hunger turned inward, when it fed only on resentment, it became dangerous. The roses bloomed again in time, as roses always do. Their beauty returned, uncomplicated and honest. They asked only for care, not admiration. Miss Marple thought that if people were more like flowers, many tragedies might be avoided. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed peaceful once more. Yet beneath the calm lay a lesson that would not soon be forgotten. Evil, Miss Marple knew, rarely announced itself. It arrived quietly, wearing the face of usefulness, speaking in the language of kindness, and tending things just a little too carefully. And somewhere, deep within the soil of every quiet place, it waited for someone to look away. If you enjoyed this Miss Marple mystery, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another classic village crime. Let us know in the comments what clue you noticed first, and which mystery you'd like to hear next. Your support helps these stories bloom.